Good afternoon and welcome everyone to today's session called What's Next? Making the Transition from Academia to Consulting. Today's event is part of the Careers Beyond Academia series, co-sponsored by the Graduate School and the Office of Postdoctoral Services. My name is Melissa Bostrom. I am the Assistant Dean for Graduate Student Professional Development, and I'm delighted to welcome you here today. I am now going to turn things over to our expert speaker, Ryan LaRanger, PhD, and you will get to hear about his journey from a postdoc at Yale University to technical director in R&D Innovation at PreScouter. So without further ado, please join me in a warm round of virtual applause for Dr. LaRanger.
Virtual applause. It's wonderful because it's so silent. But I'm seeing things. Is it all right if I begin then?
Please.
Marvelous. First of all, don't mind my ridiculous background, such as it is. Eventually, the sun will calm down. It's just very excited for almost spring. Second of all, I'd like to thank you all for being here. It's the transition from academia to consulting can feel a little bit mysterious and a little bit daunting. I hope that this conversation and others that you have make it feel a little bit more clear. The last thing that I'll want to say is my goal here is for this to be, is it all right if for some reason I have the ability to admit people who are in the waiting room? Can I just let them in?
Yes, you can, but I'll take care of that. You don't need to, so that way you can focus on presenting.
Outstanding. So the last thing, and this is particularly important, if you have questions throughout the course of this presentation, please feel free to let me know. We've gotten a list of questions that we can go through at the end, of course, but frankly, I'd prefer for this to be as conversational as you all are comfortable with. So I don't have an easy way to see who has their hand raised with this current setup. So just please feel free to chime in. Is that clear for everyone? Magnificent, good. So hello, I'm Ryan LaRanger, a technical director at PreScouter. My primary remit are cases that are at the intersection of business strategy and scientific innovation. In terms of my background, after doing my master's in business at the Keck Graduate Institute, I did my PhD at the University of Texas Southwestern Medical Center. There I focused on tissue engineering. I had some wonderful times there. We can talk about them later if there's time. And then afterwards, I did a brief postdoc at Yale in the biomedical engineering department, after which I joined PreScouter, where I've been working for about 3.5 years now, and maybe about 2 in the technical director role. So why research consulting? PreScouter, or at PreScouter, we're a company where everyone who's at the senior manager level and at the technical director, with actually no exceptions, has a PhD in training as a scientist. And what I would argue is that generally today, having that training makes you an exceedingly competitive candidate for management consulting. Why? A big part of it is because the business landscape is changing dramatically. The rate at which scientific innovation is occurring is increasing, right? So even fields which for a long time felt very stable and safe, your steel manufacturing, your shoe manufacturing, agriculture, all of these are being disrupted to a lesser or greater degree by changes in technology and the existence of or emergence of disruptors. What that means is that what were once very hard-boiled, clear, arithmetic strategy decisions now have a number of these externalities that are much harder to fit into classic business strategy models. This is impacting everything, and it is requiring a need to go back to base principles at a bunch of these firms and determine, given the new landscape, what is our best method to move forward. What this means is that a research consulting approach that's hypothesis-driven, makes very few assumptions going in, and follows where the data leads, is something that's turning out to be very valuable. This is not only the sort of work that we focus in, but this is also the work that you'll find more and more often in more general or strategic consulting. And so a question I get often is this idea of, let's say I'm just a scientist. Why is it compelling to someone, a recruiter, that I become a management consultant when all of my work is in being a scientist? And the argument that I've made many times, and I'm delighted to continue to make, is that even if you don't have industry experience, your experience as a scientist is extraordinarily valuable, particularly in today's environment. So this just provides a list of some of the skills and ways that you can talk about them, right? It's in data collection and analysis. You do that in academia. That's an essential part of consulting. Communication, your ability to present papers, your ability to talk to people who are intelligent, but maybe they are not familiar with your field, getting them up to speed on what you do quickly, essential. Project and time management, we all have practice with that. The presentation of data, it is an essential part of your life as a PhD student or a postdoc. It remains the essential part of your life as a consultant. Your work product is a report, but a big part of whether or not they decide the report is useful or not useful is, frankly, how well you present it. Are you an engaging speaker? And that's also somewhat true in the land of academia. Your ability to write coherently, efficiently, elegantly. Your leadership. Who have you mentored? Who have you worked with before? What were the results from those teams? Your interpersonal skills. How do you deal with conflict? How do you mentor someone who's challenging to mentor? And your ability to learn and adapt. You went into a new lab. You started a new project with no experience. You got up to speed quickly. All of these things are assets that you can leverage either in conversations with PreScouter or in conversations with other management consultancies, where you can say, these are directly transferable skills to the sort of work that you do. And so I would strongly encourage a little bit of a tangent. There are a couple of papers that have been put into Nature, Science, a couple of other places, indicating that if you've gotten a postdoc, that's not very valuable for a career in consulting. I, in part, as a postdoc who went into consulting, vehemently disagree. You can absolutely leverage your going into a postdoc as part of your professional growth story, especially in terms of adaptability and leadership, that can allow you to apply for pretty senior positions, depending on your experience and expertise. So I just wanted to add that point quickly. I don't know if there are any postdocs here. I'm happy to talk about what that's like from a strategic perspective. Are there any questions here before I move on? All right. So PreScouter, I'll tell you a little bit more about our company. We've worked with most major companies. If you were to put up a board of the Fortune 500 and throw darts at it, you'd be very likely to hit more companies that we've worked with than you would miss. We help firms, some of which that are traditionally extraordinarily innovative, your Amgens, but also companies that traditionally have very standard, books of business, your Coca-Colas, your Cloroxes. We help all of these firms navigate a shifting scientific landscape and determine how that scientific landscape will impact their strategy moving forward and how they can plan to adapt to it. Now, it's the people who work in PreScouter. There's a connection to the academia side. There's a connection to the industry side, especially as many of our people, the project manager side, are, frankly, formal academics. But we also have a series of networks where if you want to stay sort of in the academic world, working with us either in a part-time capacity can give you access to companies, give you expertise, and sort of help bridge that gap to eventually getting a position in industry after trying some things and seeing what you like. On the other hand, on the industry side, you get insight into, what are the scientific trends? They get access to out-of-the-box thinking. They get access to potential future talent, frankly. And they also get to have an outside group, a series of management consultants, provide a unbiased, impartial, data-driven view of their scientific landscape. We work with people from literally everywhere. We have an analyst network, people who work with us either in a full-time or a part-time capacity, who are PhD levels in their fields, all over the world, who work with us to provide some of the secondary research that we leverage in the generation of our reports. And this network allows us to bring a lot of intellectual firepower to bear on exceedingly technical and important challenges. And part of the joy of our work on the project management side is taking all of that raw data, all of that insight, and turning it into something which is concise and answers the client's question, while leveraging other data sources as well, we can talk about later. Now, a thing I sometimes like to joke is that PreScouter is a little bit of a luxury experience for management consultancies, in part because we've been working from home for actually since before the COVID pandemic. We've always been fully remote, in part because of the way that our teams are structured. It just makes more sense for us to sort of go to the people where they are. We don't do the travel structure, which is very common in your McKinseys and your BCGs, where you fly out on Monday, you fly back on Thursday, you're home Friday, Saturday, Sunday. Can be fine, but we generally don't do that. We do some travel. Our work weeks are a little bit lower, in part because generally speaking, for our projects, we're leveraging larger teams, especially on the analyst side. And we have a number of institutional resources around primary research, the conducting of interviews, conducting of surveys and databases, which mean that on the project manager side, which is generally speaking what we recruit into, there's less requirement for you to do a lot of that groundwork yourself, and you can focus more on the experimental design and the synthesis of all of that data into a coherent story. You get a chance to develop a lot of your own projects and initiatives. I at PreScouter personally have had the chance to build out entire sort of analytical frameworks in terms of how we approach certain kinds of problems. It's been very gratifying. And I've gotten a chance to share those with colleagues and get similar ones from others of my colleagues. They're really marvelous. We also do trade project management training, and you have a chance to really sort of take ownership over a field and become a thought leader in that space at PreScouter relatively quickly. Are there any questions here before I move on? Got it. So then just in terms of a career pathway, generally speaking, we hire in at the project architect or project manager level. Someone works in that capacity and they manage on average about 7 parallel projects for the first 1 to 2 years. Then from there, they'll often get promoted to a senior project architect, where they build a practice, they manage some of their larger clients, they work more on the business development side. And someone is there, they also start doing more in the way of direct mentorship, right? Working with analysts, working with other project managers. They're often in that role for about 2 to 3 years at our company. Then from there, one often, when there is an opening, get promoted to technical director, where your focus really there is on be a thought leader in your space, build your practice, grow out pipeline, and work very closely with management at PreScouter in order to sort of make sure that everything is running smoothly in terms of the work that's being done. So then in terms of the kinds of work that we do, there's a lot. Our work is designed to be flexible. So we have this approach, we have all of these tools, and our goal tends to be meet the client where they are, give them the scale and scope that they need. Sometimes this is one-off questions. Tell me about the sustainable PVC market. Sometimes it's something more long-term. We're going to evaluate a series of sectors to understand how well our technology or our strategic approach fits with those series of needs. Sometimes it's just more broad. We're looking for innovation partners. Who are the people who are most disruptive? And sometimes it's voice of consumer. We have a product. There are a few fields that go into. Tell us where the needs are in detail. And honestly, sometimes it's brainstorming, right? We have an interest in this new market broadly. We're not really sure of exactly how to leverage what we have. Let's have a discussion. Let's have some expert panels. We work on all of these sorts of things using tools like competitive intelligence, patent analysis, review of papers, all sorts of different tools at our disposal that we bring in on an as-needed basis. Then we have the technical director, and then everyone sort of downstream from that. I'm one of the technical directors. Some of my colleagues include Charles, Joao, Maria, and Michael. I think they're all marvelous. And then the way a project tends to go is we work through a series of iterative intelligence briefings. And this is a point of not all firms do this, but I'm glad that we do, where at PreScouter, we're often dealing with unknown unknowns, where a client has basically told us, I don't know what the first order optimal best solution is, but I have some ideas. And so what we do is we do the first 2 or 3 weeks worth of work. We run some interviews, we read some papers, we look at some fields and markets, and we come back to them and we say, here's our data to date. Here are the hypotheses we've tested. Here are those initial results. Here's what we propose to do next. Where are you in that? Is that what you're looking for? Do you need us to make some adjustments or pivots? What that allows us to do is really build a closer collaboration with clients who at the beginning of an investigation may not necessarily know what they're looking for. And it allows us to tailor the experiments and build them on that quick cycle basis to eventually create a report which addresses their answer and also accounts for a series of unknown unknowns that otherwise we wouldn't be able to, in my opinion, properly deal with. And life beyond PreScouter, we've had people from all sort of walks of life join the company at varying levels. We've had, for instance, Dr. Gareth work in our company for a while. He's since moved on to 3M. For us, he was a wonderful alumni. We have a bunch of those actually, where he was with us for a few years. He went from academia to really getting a crash course on all of these different ways that experimental design can be leveraged for, frankly, excellence in management consulting. And then he got a career at 3M where he's very happy. And we have had other alumni move on to even other consulting firms like McKinsey. And it's been overall marvelous. We do our best to stay in touch. Then in terms of how to engage with PreScouter, I know there are people here at varying levels of their career. So I'm going to talk about this in 2 separate buckets. There is the full-time position, which we recruit for on a seasonal basis. We have the winter recruiting cycle and we have the upcoming summer recruiting cycle. So definitely keep your eye out for that. But we also have analyst part-time, where people who are at institutions presently or who are wrapping up their work can get some experience and see, is this the sort of work that I would want to do, right? Get some lines on your resume in terms of working as an analyst. For the full-time project architects, they act, you can think of it a little bit like being a PI, where your role is to design the experiment, interpret the results that your colleagues get you from the experiments that have been run, interpret those results, and then build the next experiment. The work is flexible and remote. There's competitive compensation, health insurance, et cetera, et cetera. For the analysts who are working with us in a part-time capacity, you get a chance to build your network, industry relevant skills. The time is pretty minimal in terms of what we ask for on a week-to-week basis, and you can decide how many projects that you're on with no commitment for an upper or lower end. And we're, of course, always welcoming applicants for the analyst network. And then this is my profile, and I believe we have hit the end. Yep, there we are. So this is the primary end of the project. If there are additional questions or if we have some time, I have some projects that I could go through here, just that talk about the sort of work that we've done. But I would like for us to make sure that we have time for questions, as there are so many. And so at this point, I have a list. There's also the chat. So if anyone has any questions, please raise your hand and I will call on sort of a case-by-case basis just to keep this from becoming, an issue immediately. And my apologies if I pronounce any name incorrectly. I'm, Anjali?
Hey, Anjali, thank you.
Anjali, thank you.
Yeah, great presentation. I just was curious, do you all specialize in certain areas with your consulting, like environmental, like, yeah, I don't know if there's any specialties that you focus in, or are you pretty broad with regards to like the problems or projects you take on?
Anjali, that is a wonderful question. So in terms of the kinds of projects that we generally take on, we have a series of focus areas. So we have life sciences, consumer packaged goods, we have natural resources, and a few others. And in those, we have some degree of specialty, but we don't really have a focus which is that narrow, say, sustainability per se. Often people come to us with a very, very broad reach of problem, or question, I should say. Does that address your question?
Yeah, it does. Thank you.
Excellent. Are there other questions? And I'm just pausing for a moment while I bring up the full list. So if anything comes up and I don't see it, oh, there we are. Okay, so let me just bring up the list of submitted questions and then I'll go through those in exactly a second. We have the registration. Ah, there we are. So we have one person who has asked, once I bring the thing up, bear with me. Ah, good. There's less sun immediately in my eyes. How do you find consulting firms and then compare them with other industry or government positions? This is a wonderful question. This comes from a postdoc in the field of nursing. So applying for consulting jobs is a little bit of a fan dance, actually. What I would recommend at a high level, and if someone needs me to go into more depth, we certainly can, is first of all, you interface with your local consulting club. There should be one, there is one at your institution. They often have regular events where recruiters from companies like PreScouter, McKinsey, BCG, and other firms will come and Duke Advanced Degree Consulting. Perfect. Thank you, Melissa. People or recruiters will come in from those firms. Sometimes they'll be involved in case competitions, and they'll make you aware of when their recruiting season is. And then, generally speaking, you'll want to interface with them, send them an email, and then you apply on their website during that season. That is the formal way to get a job at a consulting firm for where you all are presently. Interface with your consulting club, and that's the way to do it. Don't just apply on the website to the things that are just sort of there. Generally speaking, that's not the route. There are also, and this is important to note, generally speaking, a management consulting firm will have networking events. Often they will be run through the DACC, but not always. Attend those and get a chance to see, is this for me? When this person talks about the work that they do they seem happy? And that's a good way to think about it. Then when you compare with other industry or government positions, there are a few considerations. When you are looking at salary, generally speaking, a consulting job will pay more than other industry or government positions. But especially for McKinsey or BCG or some of these other firms, you will often have to do much more travel. PreScouter is an exception in that regard, but the idea generally remains, where the hours are generally speaking a little bit longer. That is a little bit true for all of us. The other thing which is worth noting is you can think about it in terms of cycle time for questions being asked. One of the things that really stands out in consulting relative to other jobs is that in consulting, you are asked to solve questions very quickly, and you have a large variety in terms of the kinds of questions you are being asked to solve. In other industry jobs or in government jobs or as a scientist, you will often work on the same problem at more depth for longer. And so that's just a matter of what kind of problems you like to work on, how much execution you're interested in. Would you prefer to just sort of say, here's the plan, give it to someone and then move on? Or is there something more in depth you'd like to do? That's sort of the idea operationally. Does that answer your question? And does anyone else have follow-ups from that before I move on? Okay, then we'll move right on to the next, which is the someone who has biochemistry as a postdoc has asked one of the best questions a postdoc can ask, I suppose. Does an academic postdoc add any value beyond the PhD research? Is it preferred or recommended? From my experience personally, I find that people who have done, even if it's a bench postdoc, tend to be more well prepared for consulting than people who go right into it from a PhD. I'll explain why. Someone who has made the leap to postdoc demonstrates a certain amount of resilience in terms of they were comfortable at one place, but they were also able to succeed at a second place, right? Where they were put in a completely new environment. They were asked to work often on a completely new project, and they excelled at that to some degree. So that right away demonstrates resilience, self-sufficiency, and that's very valuable. It also is indicative of leadership. Especially if you're a postdoc who's had to mentor students, which many postdocs do. Postdocs often take on more of a manager role at a laboratory. So if you highlight that, that's a point of value for you. The last thing I will say is when you're doing a postdoc, especially if you're doing a postdoc at an elite institution, which I would argue you're doing a postdoc at an elite institution, that's a chance for you to build your network, join some student organizations, leverage the alumni network, and use that as a way to propel your career. This is something that I did with my postdoc at Yale, by way of example. It was a new environment, new network. I could start from scratch and really determine where do I want to go next. And that was a big part of what empowered my movement onward to PreScouter. Then in terms of helpful courses to take during the transition, but before I move on to that question, does anyone have any follow-ups on the academic postdoc question? I'm quite happy to talk about it in more length, as that was my personal experience, but I wanted to give just a high level. If you are a postdoc, it is the opposite of too late. You can always transition out, frankly. Don't feel pressure to transition out, of course, but if you're here, it suggests to me that you might be interested in it. So a postdoc can absolutely be a point of leverage. Just take advantage of it, right? On your resume, highlight, here are my leadership experiences. Here's the resilience I demonstrated moving on to a new project. Here's how quickly I got up to speed and became an expert in X. Are there any questions here? If not, delighted to move on. Okay, excellent. So for the next question that we have here, what are some helpful courses to take during the transition? Love it. So what don't you need? R or C++? What do you need? Deep familiarity with the Google Suite, Slides, Sheets, and the respective Microsoft version, Excel, PowerPoint, right? There are some excellent courses that they don't have to be at your program. Coursera has a number of very, very good ones on basic creation of business modeling using an Excel, on the creation of elegant slides, which if you're interested in taking a particular course, take ones like that to get you familiar with that sort of business logic. And that's sort of the expectations that people will have on how elegant, how beautiful your slides are and your Excel models are for a space. Learn about pivot tables. It'll help. The other thing that I would say is there are actually some book recommendations I generally like to give, one of which is somewhat obvious. The other one might surprise you. The obvious book that I would strongly recommend, ideally before you begin the interview process at all for consulting, would be, let me just pull this up here, Case Endpoint or Case in Point. That is a particularly valuable book for a couple of reasons. Not only because it's, in my opinion, it's an excellent interview preparation book for the case interview, which is one of the key gateways between you and a career in academia and in a career in consulting. That's point one. Point two, it is very useful primer for some of the most essential skills that you will need to succeed in management consulting. That idea of taking a case, that idea of reframing a question after it's been asked to you. Thank you, Melissa, that's really excellent. The other book that I would recommend, so that's point one. Like if you're going to take a course, read that book, practice it with someone, develop an understanding of those sorts of frameworks, become comfortable with running a case. It will benefit you not only in that interview, but for the rest of your career. Point two, a book that I often like to recommend is Angelica Hoffman's Scientific Writing and Communication. This is a book that's primarily about scientific writing, particularly grant writing. The reason why I recommend it is because it is an excellent resource for developing a sense of efficiency of language. In consulting, a lot of what we do is presentation. We're disseminating things for people who don't have a lot of time, who don't have a lot of spare attention, who need to be impressed by what you are saying quickly. Having a deep familiarity with that kind of elegance and efficiency in writing can make your final materials that you present and even the discussions that you have more compelling and frankly more likely to turn into additional sales. So those are two books that I would recommend on top of helpful courses. Are there any questions here before I move on? Also, if you need other book recommendations, I can go on all day about that topic in particular. Poor Megan has heard me just run basically book clubs at PreScouter on this topic. But any other questions here before I move on? Okay, so then next on the list, how do you build clear presentation skills and casing? This is from someone with someone who is pursuing a master's. They're in their first year, and they are in engineering management. One sentence that describes the totality of our experience. Building clear presentation skills and building a strong case is a critical skill for management consultants. It is also very challenging. There's actually a couple of pretty simple ways to at least begin that process, to become good at this. And that is to ask yourself some questions, basically to develop what I would call client empathy. You want to be able to look at something that you've written or something that you are thinking of writing and say, have I adequately explained the process for this person? And does my explanation of this process, does the case, does the presentation, does it address the primary reason why they are asking for this, right? And so when you have a case study, when you have a case question, I find one thing that helps me a great deal is to ask not only, in a sentence, describe what this person wants, right? Tactically, like if they're asking for market analysis of solar panels and what new innovative technologies are coming there and how it may disrupt the space. the first thing that I would ask is, how do I describe that in a single sentence? Well, for you, I've already done it. No need to do it twice. I would then also ask myself, why do they need this information, right? Are they currently in the space and they're looking for competitors? Are they thinking of entering the space and they're trying to see how well their technology stacks up with what currently exists? Are they a business development group looking for a new, innovative, academic solution to purchase? All of these things, if I can describe that motivation in a single sentence as well, in a simple one, then the actual presentation will, with luck, have that be the first thing that I address, right? Focus on their needs and have a deep understanding of it, explain it simply. And then from there, when I'm building a presentation, I'll normally say something along the lines of, for our results for this round of research, how do I describe that in a sentence? And, of course, you're dealing with hundreds of pages of material that you're breaking down into a sentence. You can't say everything. And so you need to engage in the subtle art of subtraction and it's interesting, there have been studies on this. It is much, much harder for a person to take a body of work and remove something from it than it is to add something to it. Subtraction is very, very hard. And so if this exercise feels difficult for you, that's very normal. But you have to take all this beautiful data that you've collected and say, all right, what is the single most important thing that I can describe in a sentence? And if you can do that, then you will, and if you've done that exercise well, your presentation will necessarily be compelling to your audience because they feel that you are focusing entirely on their need. And you don't have the burden of saying 100,000 words. All you need to do is say a few, and they're the ones they want to hear. So that's what I would say is the easiest way to give a compelling presentation. That was a couple of complex concepts. I'm delighted to take any questions on this before I move on to the next question, which is brief but extraordinarily interesting. So are there any questions on that or anything else I've spoken of before I move on? Again, please feel free to raise a hand or frankly, also just feel free to shout if you have an interesting question. Or if you have a question and you're not sure if it's interesting, it's also completely fine. Okay, next on the list, opportunity during recession, parentheses now, from a master's in fintech, second year. I love this question, in part because it allows me to question the premise. Not 100% sure there's going to be a recession. Recent economic data suggests that we might dodge that proverbial bullet, but the point is very well taken. How recession-proof is management consultancy versus other fields? This is a question that's somewhat open to debate, but I'll give the best answer that I can. By and large, we find at PreScouter that companies are more interested in purchasing analytics, especially around things like disruption, purchasing of new companies, and so on, when their budgets are somewhat constrained and they can't hire, right? Because the business problems still come. They still have to deal with the work that they have to deal with in that year. But if there's a recession and a hiring freeze, they have fewer resources with which to address those questions. And that's where a management consultant can come in and provide that analysis without having to go through all the costs of hiring, training, firing risk, HR, et cetera, right? They hire a consultant, the job gets done. And so I would argue management consulting work, especially if you're working for a firm that has a strong existing book of business, can be relatively recession-proof. Of course, nothing is perfect. Questions or thoughts on that before I move on? Okay. So then the next thing I would say is, this is by a PhD student in pharmacology who is a second year. What do I consider to be most difficult about the application process? This may surprise you. I do not think it is the case interview. the case interview has the biggest, baddest rap for the application for management consultancy. But personally, I would say the biggest challenge that I've seen with applicants is not, can you crush a case study? It is instead, are you an engaging conversationalist and speaker? How are your empathy skills? How well do you connect with your audience? How do you deal with a stressful situation? And can you be someone else wants to speak to? I've seen a few otherwise quite strong candidates flop at that portion, soft skills. So this is one of the things that can also be hardest to train, developing that sort of client empathy, thinking about things from that perspective, practicing speaking with confidence, reading some of the books that we've discussed, particularly Case in Point, practicing these sorts of analysis, becoming familiar with the work. That is one of the easiest ways to get over it. But by and large, I would argue the soft skills portion of these interviews can be one of the hardest things, because it's all interviews are to some degree or another somewhat unfair, right? It's you're being asked to display your best possible self in an extremely high stakes environment. And that's hard to do. If you can work on and master that skill, it will serve you extraordinarily well in the interview process. One of the things that I would argue, just while we're on this point, is helpful for developing this skill, I just said there's no way to do it, and I was wrong, it's fine, is I don't know if you've been introduced to the idea of the informational interview. If you have, Melissa, I'm leaning on you for this a little bit. This has been discussed before, right, with this group? I'm seeing head nods. Excellent. Let me rigorously endorse this as a practice for not only getting you to your next step in your career, but also in terms of generating these soft skills. A informational interview, right, where it's a cold email, having success there, having coffee with someone who you've never met before to talk about your potential future career is one of the best ways to work those muscles and to develop a sense of comfort in what is normally an extremely stressful situation. I cannot stress this enough. It's even if you get nothing in terms of the improvement to your network from the engaging of this process, I would argue it is still very much in your best interest to conduct some informational interviews and become more comfortable with those kinds of conversations. It will serve you very, very well. Are there any questions on that point before I move on? Okay. Well, then we have a PhD student in biomedical engineering. Excellent. Which is for a PhD student having to apply this cycle, graduating this year. Congratulations. What are my recommendations on the strategy for the next few months? Okay. So person who is in this position, again, congratulations if you are on the line. But this is something where you will want to make sure that you are connecting with the consulting firms. Have a couple of these things going at once. If you haven't read Case in Point or similar books, the sooner you start on that process, the better. Engage in some practice cases with friends. Become familiar with that process. Think about some of the things that we've discussed today. Maybe engage in some informational interviews. In particular, definitely engage in some informational interviews with people who work at the consulting firms you are interested in applying to. That should be done in parallel with the regular application process, not as a replacement for. That will make you feel more comfortable with the firms. That will let you learn more about their culture. Questions like, what sort of attitude do they expect me to come in with? Things like, should I wear jeans or slacks to the interview? Right? These are questions you should know the answer to before interview one. So cannot stress enough, if you are in that position, it is not an emergency by any stretch of the imagination. And you will want to engage in all the things that we've discussed today to make sure that you are able to hit the ground running when the formal interview process kicks off. Generally speaking, interviews happen in, oh God, this changes year from year. The interviews happen in the summer, but the time to start preparing is right now. Are there any questions about that from a timing perspective? What other things can you work on that front? Happy to take any questions you might have. Okay, then we'll move on to one of my last ones, which is from a master's student in critical Asian humanities, which is, what can we do as students in humanities? This is a very interesting question, because at its heart, consulting is a human-centric business, right? We are dealing with human-centric problems. One of the biggest classes of investigation that I conduct is almost anthropological. It's a voice of consumer study, right? I'm building experiments around taking the opinions of lots of people and distilling them down into probability clouds, which can then be, put into calculations, right? You need to make sure that you have your value proposition clear. If you do research, talk about what kind of research it is. If you are an excellent writer, highlight that. If you have developed a deep understanding of the ethnographic, of a particular ethnographic field, magnificent, right? You can leverage that as deep insight that can inform your business strategy, your analytics work. I would, as a person in the humanities space, make sure that I've taken some courses on things like building out, business models in Excel, in making compelling consulting documents using, PowerPoint or Google Slides. I would take some of that and have that be collateral in your back pocket. Join PreScouter as an analyst, do some projects, get that under your belt as well. And that's an easy way for you to flesh out what needs fleshing out. But honestly, it's a rigorous study of the humanities is absolutely important, or can be important, for the sort of work that not only we do, but the work that many other of our peer firms do. I hope I've made that as clear as I possibly can. Are there any questions on that point?
Hey, yeah, I had one follow-up question on that. How much does your PhD topic actually matter for consulting?
Oh gosh, Joshua, that's a very excellent question. I'm going to give you a slight cop-out answer, but bear with me. I would argue it matters as much as you make it matter. So, for instance, for my PhD topic, it was tissue engineering, right? Lung tissue engineering specifically. And so that is a thing that can inform some of my kinds of projects, and it can allow me to connect with my audience when it's a tissue engineering audience. But I do work in all sorts of sectors. So sometimes it comes up and sometimes it doesn't. As a professional, I could choose, I'm really comfortable with this niche, I want to focus on that. And then that would be a different story. So it really depends on how focused you decide to be when you work at a consulting firm, and what connections you made there. Does that make sense?
Yes, sir. Thank you.
Absolutely. Anjali, I believe you were next.
Hey, yeah, I want to know if you could speak more to your analyst program and how that works, and also the application process and things of that nature.
I would be delighted. The simplest version is the analyst program. You can apply to it by going to the PreScouter website, which I believe is linked The application process is there and it's relatively straightforward. As an analyst, you can apply to work on projects. You build a profile, resume, etc. And then you apply on a project by project basis where you say basically, like, here are the 20, 30 investigations that are going on right now. I would be interested in working on X and Y. And then you would basically join the analyst team. And the way it generally works from there is you get a prompt, which gives you background on the field that we're investigating, the resources that we have at our disposal for that project. And then we generally work from shared Google documents, normally in Excel and slides, where you enter in, information on particular companies or technologies or papers that you think would be a good match for the question, right? So in other words, questions can be things such as, what are innovative new strategies that groups are employing to build better solar panels? And then it would be up to you to sort of look at, here are some interesting groups, here are some papers, here are the relative performance values, and sort of putting them into the system, making your case basically as to what makes them excel, what makes them excel, and then that gets synthesized into a report that a project manager makes. So the nice thing is, from a resume perspective, you can just put it as worked as analyst for PreScouter, and then you can say, like, here are the projects that I've worked on. Normally, the expectation is pretty low. I think per project, it's like between 4 and 8 hours per week tops. I actually did it once upon a time myself, and it was very fun. I enjoyed it a lot. Obviously, I'm a little biased, but Anjali, does that answer your question?
Yeah, it does. Thank you. I appreciate it.
My pleasure. Garima?
Hi, Ryan. Thank you so much for the excellent presentation. And I must appreciate that you are answering every question very patiently. So thank you for that.
I'm trying my best.
Yeah, I'll take 2 minutes of yours so that you can understand exactly what I'm asking. My PhD is from Japan, and I completed it a few years back, and then I went back to India and did a postdoc. And during COVID period, I joined a Medcom consultancy, Singapore based, and I work remotely in India as a scientific advisor. And now I'm at Duke since October 2022 on H1B. So I just want to understand whether you welcome international students at your firm.
I mean, yes, my goodness.
What about...
Let me take it from
my concern is, Ryan, I'm so sorry.
No, please go on.
My concern is, we hear all the time there are multiple layoffs, and academia seems safer for H1B candidates. So is this the reality, or is this just assuming everything?
So different firms. This is a wonderful question. So what you're effectively asking, let me make sure I understand. You are in this sort of almost crossroads where you're H1B, you're international. You're wondering, is it more worthwhile for me to stay in academia, or should I go into industry because I'm hearing about all these layoffs in the tech sector?
No,
right?
But I have worked in industry for almost 13 months. So I really like the pace of industry. I do not want to stay in the loop of postdoc, to be honest.
That's reasonable.
But at the same time, I'm worried. I mean, if I'm making a wrong decision, because industry, sometimes, the layoffs are just, news are wild everywhere.
So let me address your question from a few angles, if that's okay.
Yeah, please.
First of all, the layoff news, generally speaking, is it's not quite a black swan event, but it's a cyclical thing that happens particularly at larger tech firms. We have not been seeing a broad drop in layoffs across the economy. So that's sort of one thing to keep in mind. The second one that I would say is this. If you have experience at a management consulting firm, particularly, so especially if you go into management consulting, you become in extremely high demand. So even in the case where one was to be laid off, someone with that background or pedigree would have a very easy time finding another job.
Okay.
The reason for this is because having experience at a management consulting firm is basically a seal of approval that says this person can get up to speed on a topic very quickly. They can drive sales through demonstrated client empathy and analytics, and they can efficiently deliver results in a self-driven way. These are extraordinarily rare commodities in any sense, and particularly in industry. And so firms are usually very quick to hire people who have consulting as a background.
Okay.
And the infinite postdoc loop, in my opinion, is only sort of safer. It kind of is, but at the same time, it's there are enough dynamics there that my personal suggestion would be, especially if you go into the field of consulting, which you already have at least to some degree, you are eminently employable. Does that make sense?
Yeah. Thank you so much.
My pleasure. Are there any other? We've got 2 minutes. Let's see if we can't make the most of them. Are there any other questions that I can help you all with? And by the way, I appreciate people jumping in with questions. I know it's tricky with a large group like this, but I've been very happy with the interactivity. Thank you very much for it. Going once, going twice. Any last questions before we sign off? Okay. Well, then I believe, let me just double check it. Yes, okay. I didn't want to be respectful of everyone's time. Melissa, team, thank you all very much for having me. I believe you have access to my contact information. If you have any other questions, if there's something today that we talked about which you'd like to ask me about, if you have questions about working at PreScouter, etc., please feel free to reach out to me on LinkedIn or any other medium. Happy to talk. I hope that this was helpful, and thank you so much for your time. And Melissa, thank you so much for the clutch links. That was really great.
Thank you so much, Ryan, for your willingness to answer so many questions. I think this was a terrific learning experience. Really appreciate your partnership.
My sincere pleasure. I hope to do this again. Thank you all very much. I hope you have an excellent evening.